Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another discussion about our district and schools budget for the 24-25 school year. I am Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez. I am the superintendent. And before we get started, I just want to give some guidance to our Spanish-speaking audience and community members on how to access the interpretation feature on Zoom. Para aquellos que necesitan escuchar en español o necesitan interpretación, pueden ver que tienen que hacer el clic en el enlace de Zoom que se le envió por correo electrónico en la última hora. Utilizaremos la función de interpretación de Zoom para proporcionar la interpretación en español en este seminario web, y cuando ingrese al seminario web de Zoom, mire hacia el lado derecho de la barra de menú en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Así puede hacer clic en el botón que contiene una imagen del globo terráqueo, como pueden ver aquí, y seleccione español para escuchar la traducción al español. También pueden volver a hacer clic en el icono del globo terráqueo y seleccionar Mute Original Audio Channel si no desea escuchar el audio en inglés en lo absoluto. So tonight, throughout our presentation, we're going to be answering some questions that we have received prior to the event. So if there are questions that come up for you throughout the presentation, you can ask us here, and then to our those that are joining us via Zoom, you can ask the questions via the chat feature, and we're going to do our best to answer all of them tonight. And in terms of what we will cover, so tonight's presentation will be just a little bit different from the forum that we hosted in November. And the difference is going to be that the content, the information, and the flow, we're going to go over our district priorities, which guide the decisions that we make about our resources, and then the process for developing the budget. We're also going to provide an updated look at the projected budget, including how we got there. So you'll hear tonight, where are we as of today, even though this is still a fluid developing process. And then we're going to take the rest of the time to have some conversations and to answer questions and talk about what are the next steps. So we'll get going. So when we think about our budget, we're always thinking about revenue or money that comes in terms of money that comes into us, and then the money that has to go out, which is the money that we have to pay so that we can provide the support and the education for all of our students. So to create a balanced budget, we need to make sure that the revenue, right, the money that comes in, matches the expenses. And that's really the task that we have. That's what we're trying to work to do. We need to ensure that we're not only spending the money that is available, but also that we're using the money on what is needed most. So the majority of the revenue that comes from grants from the city, the state, and the federal government. And throughout the last decade, right, the last 10 years, we've had relatively stagnant revenue. That means that it hasn't shifted much, despite the fact that our costs, our expenses are going up. The revenue stays the same. And we'll get more into what that means and what that looks like in the slides ahead. In terms of the expenses, right, the money that we have to pay out, that include what we are also obligated to provide to meet the needs of our students. This includes not only the students that go to Hartford Public Schools, but also the students that live in our city that choose to attend schools in other districts. So we're financially responsible for those students as well. So in addition to tuition, expenses include salaries, right? Because we have to pay our educators, supplies, instructional supplies, transportation. And the last thing I want to note is in regards to revenue, right? The money that comes in and the expenses is that we allocate resources based on our equity centered formula. And we're going to share with you, we're going to share what that is and how that translates into the school allocations. So schools are receiving revenue and staff assignments in alignment with the size of their school, the grade levels, and then the levels of student need. So there is going to be some variance, some variability. It's going to look a little different in schools based on that size, also based on the grade levels, and based on what the students need. So as I mentioned, Hartford Public Schools receives the majority of its funding from the city, the state, and the federal government. And we're going to take a closer look at our state funding structures. But so before we jump into the next few slides, I do want to just want to note that these numbers that we see here are from 2022. So we just want to use them as a reference, right? Although there are some minor changes, really the story, the point that we want to come across remains the same. And that is that on paper, Hartford Public Schools receives more money for each student than other districts in the state, right? We hear people say that all the time. Why are you asking for more money? You already get more money than everyone else does. As you can see here, however, due to two funding structures, we actually end up having less money per student than other districts. And I'm gonna explain that now, right? So in this next slide, shows the comparison between Hartford Public Schools and the state average when it comes to tuition costs. Because of we operate in an ecosystem of school choice, Hartford Public Schools has the highest number of students that attend schools in other districts, whether they're operated by other magnet operators, whether in open choice. So as I mentioned earlier, we are still responsible for all of the Hartford resident students, regardless of where they choose to attend school. And that means that we have to pay for their tuition when they go out of the district. So in 2021-22, for example, 22% of our overall budget was spent on tuition cost. So when you compare that, right, to the state average, is only at 7% at the state average. That's a big difference. And we know that there is the obligation, if you will, the agreement, I should say, the chef agreement, where over the next couple of years, more seats will become available for Hartford residents to attend non-Hartford schools. And so we could be projecting that over the next, 8 years or so, it can cost us an additional $40 million in tuition. So the other structure, right? I said there were two structures. The other structure that impacts our per pupil cost is special education. We do serve a higher number of special education students than most other districts. It cost us an additional $62 million in special education services. And we are committed to make sure that we deliver on the needs and the resources that our students need. That is equal to 17% of our budget. Almost, when you look at the numbers here, it's almost triple what the state average is. And then complicating this is the fact that the state's funding covers less than half of our special education costs. So we get some money back, but we don't get 100% of the money back. So that adds another level of difficulty for us. We also know that as a result of the pandemic, there are, and other factors, right? Student needs have been increasing and they're going to continue to increase in districts across the state and across the country. But in communities like ours, in urban communities that have been disproportionately impacted, we're anticipating an increase in student need not just this year, but in years to come. So of course, that means that there's an increase in costs as well. And when we take into consideration the special education costs, the tuition costs that we're paying, then actually Hartford Public Schools has about $3,000 less per student than the state average, despite having a higher concentration of student need, right? So when you hear people say, and we hear it all the time, you already get more money. Well, we have to look at those specific cost structures that at the end of it, it means we actually have less money, and we're serving a higher level of need. So yeah, it forces us to make some really difficult decisions when it comes to our budget, because we have a lot less room to play with and to make decisions compared to other districts. So that's the big picture and understanding why is our situation so unique and so challenging. So what I'm going to do, Deputy Foster, I'm going to ask you to just for the next slide, if you could just give a brief overview of like where actually are we in terms of the numbers. Then I'll go back to talk about our priorities, and then we'll get into more of the nitty gritty if you don't mind.
Good evening. So what you see on the slide, we want to be as transparent as possible as we build this budget. And so you actually see 3 columns here, and I just want to walk you through this. The first column, and you heard the superintendent talk about building a budget is essentially making sure that the amount of money we're spending matches the amount of money we have. And so the first row, that's the revenue, right? That's the amount of money we have to spend. The second row is the amount of what it's going to cost us to provide the same services we've been providing as a district to our students. And then at the bottom is the difference, right? So when we say we have a deficit, what we're saying is the amount of money it would cost us to meet the needs of our students in the same way we've been meeting the needs of our students this current year is more than the amount of money we are expecting to have available next year. But the other thing I want you to know about our budget process is the numbers change, right? So we start with an initial projection. We say, this is what we think is the money that we're going to have, and this is what we think our costs are going to be. But there's a lot of moving parts. So, and I'll just give an example. Like when you see that first row that says projected revenue, we have more than 40 state and federal grants that contribute to our overall budget. And we have to work to figure out, we don't always know at this point in the year or even earlier in the year, what the actual amount of those grants is going to be for next year. And so we do projecting. We say, this is what we think each of these grants is going to be worth. And I'm telling you that because the first column where it says initial projection, that's what we were, if any of you were here, we had a community forum on January 11th. And those are the numbers we shared in that first column on January 11th. We thought we were going to have $426.6 million in money to spend in revenue. We estimated our costs at that time at $504 million. Now, what you need to know about the $504 million is we included something in that number. We included $17 million in positions and programs that we have been paying for with COVID relief money. So we, for 3 years, have had access to additional money in support of the recovery from the COVID pandemic. This current year is the last year we have access to that fund. And so, but some of those programs and some of those positions need to continue. So when we shared that initial projection in January, we shared a projection that included about $17 million in those added expenses. And so at the end of the day, when we had a community forum in January, we were projecting that we had $78 million more in expenses than we were going to have in revenue. We then gathered more information, right? We learned more. Our revenue went down a little bit, right? There was one of those state grants where we were expecting it to be slightly higher than it's going to be. That's why you see it went from 426 to 425, not a big deal. On the expenses side, we went ahead and pulled out that $17 million. So when you see the second column that says revised projection, that assumes that we don't continue any of the spending that we've been doing this year using COVID relief dollars. And so that helped, right? We went from a $77 million deficit to a $56 million deficit. So the last column was an unhappy wrinkle for us. So the governor, I think about 2 weeks ago, released his proposed changes for next year's state budget. So in the state budget that was passed last year, one of the things the state legislature did is they proposed a cap on our general education tuition. You heard the superintendent talk about we pay tuition to magnet schools and other schools where our kids who live in Hartford go. The legislature said we're going to cap that. We're going to say that those providers who serve Hartford students but aren't Hartford Public Schools, they can't charge more than 58% of what they charge this year. So that was good news for us because you heard the superintendent talk about how big tuition is as a part of our budget. Unfortunately, a couple weeks ago when the governor released his budget, part of what he included in that proposal was to get rid of that 58% cap. And so when you look at the third column here, what you see is our expenses jumped up from 481.7 to 493.2 million. And that has an effect on our deficit. Now, our revenue also went up a little bit because in the governor's budget, the projection of how much revenue we would get in ECS, which is education cost sharing, was projected to go up a little bit. So the revenue went up to 429 million, but not having a cap on tuition means we would have to pay an $11 million more in tuition than we were expecting to when we shared the first column with you. And so at the end of the day, we went from a $56 million deficit to if the governor's budget is adopted in the way it was proposed, our deficit then becomes 63 million. So that encouraging news when we went from January 11th, where we said 77 million to 56, took a hit with the governor's budget to bringing us back to a $63 million deficit. So what that functionally means, and we're going to get into what we're thinking about how to do this, the budget exercise we have to go through as a Hartford Public Schools community is we have to think about what are the things we can do without, to the tune of $63 million, right? We don't have the ability to spend money that we do not have. And so that's really the exercise we have to go through. And I believe the superintendent is going to talk about how we're thinking about our priorities.
And what do you like for dinner?
So the challenge becomes trying to do more with less, knowing that the needs of our students and actually the support that we have to provide also for our educators, right, still exist. So while we explore various mitigation strategies, and by mitigation we mean how is it that we're gonna make the money that comes in and the money that has to go out align? Right? How do we mitigate? How do we bridge those two? I don't want us to lose focus on what we can cut or how our vacancies might save us money. We have to focus on that, but we also have to focus on how can we make efficient and very strategic investments so that right the needs of our students are centered in the priorities. And so what you see here are two district priorities. One is rigorous tier 1 core instruction, and that is like high quality classroom teachers and robust professional learning, coaching and curriculum and teaching. And on the other side, the other priority is students being connected to school through extracurricular activities and other relevant coursework, clubs, other supports, social emotional learning and supports, right? The efficiencies come when we can recognize, are there any shared resources across these two priorities? And how can we engage partners, for example, to offer some of those essential services to our students so that we can invest more strategically into the classroom and on instructional opportunities. And I would also want to make sure that we were funding effective foundational classes, right, that are going to benefit our students. For example, we know that we have requirements at the state. The state has specific requirements with regard to coursework and credit requirements. And so we have to tend to all of those and then see, okay, what other classes can be layered on top of that to create more comprehensive offerings and opportunities. So these are the sort of conversations and the thinking that we want to have, right? Ensuring that we're not sacrificing our priorities while also developing creative ways with more limited resources. Okay, so Deputy Foster, I'm going to tag you back in to get into the deep and the details.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to do, and we want to get to questions soon, but I'm going to move. We want to talk a little about, we've been working at this, right? We had a community forum in November, we had one in January, and overall at that time, we're working on what the superintendent talked about, the mitigation, right? So how do we close that $63 million gap that I just shared with you? And so these are some of the steps that we're taking. And particularly the first one, I'm going to go into some significant detail on, because I know that lots of folks are interested in what's happening with school budgets. So one step we're taking is school-based budgets. So because of that deficit, schools will not be able to have the same level of funding that they have this year. But one of the trade-offs we decided to make is to give individual schools greater flexibility about how to use the resources they have. So they've always had some flexibility and autonomy. But we want to expand on that within requirements, right? You heard the superintendent say, there are things we have to do. So a school can't cut a program or a position if it's necessary to do something that we are required by law to do. But we wanted to give some flexibility because we believe, right, that our school communities, our school principals, their teams, they're closest to the work happening with the students in their school. And we wanted to give our schools some opportunity to think about knowing that we will have less, right? That's just a given. Knowing that we will have less in each of our schools next year in terms of dollars, we wanted our schools to be part of that conversation around where do they want to focus. So that's the school-based budgets. That's one step. Another step is efficient allocation of district services to schools. So there are many things in our budget where if you look at the budget book or you look at our reports, they look like they're in central office, but it's actually people and programs that are in schools every day. And a good example are instructional coaches. These are staff who, in our budget, they show up as part of central office, but every day they're in classrooms supporting teachers to grow in their own professional practice. You see other examples here. Many of our special education supports, obviously our building and grounds, right? Our facility staff who are out there maintaining our buildings, security, and you see the list there. So one of the second step we're working on is how do we maintain those services, but do it more efficiently, do it with less dollars. Reductions in central office, right? We know we want to protect what's happening in our schools. And so we are going to be making reductions in our central office in order to make sure that we're preserving as much funding as possible for the work happening in schools. And the other steps we can take are really more technical steps. You heard the superintendent mention vacancies, right? We don't ever have every position filled, right? And so if we have a position that's in our budget, a teaching position, for example, but we don't have a teacher who's in that position because we weren't able to find someone with the right license or whatever, we won't spend that salary, at least for the amount of time that position is vacant. And across an organization as big as the Hartford Public Schools, that can amount to a lot of money over a year. So for example, if we make an assumption that 4% of our positions will be vacant next year, that can amount to about $11 million in savings. And so that's another way we can work to solve the deficit. And then lastly, we're expecting to have the vast majority of our COVID relief funding spent this year. But we are also working to preserve as much as we can because we can spend COVID relief money in July, August, and September. It doesn't expire till September 30th. We're going to preserve as much as we can to offset some of the cuts that we would potentially have to make if we didn't have that money available. So I want to go deeper on the school-based budget and the autonomy that I talked about. So you see on the left-hand side of this slide, why are we doing this? I already spoke to this a little bit. More flexibility for schools to make strategic choices about how they use the resources in their building. We did establish some minimum expectations, right? Going back to the compliance and the fact that there are certain things we have to maintain. We also want to support resource sharing. So as schools are building their budgets, they can have conversations about whether they might want to share a particular teaching position, who might be part-time in one school, part-time in another. And the other thing is, we want to centrally allocate for positions that schools don't, we don't want to make schools budget for things that where the decisions are made at central office, right? So at central office, for example, we decide based on the particular facility needs of a building, how many custodians they need. We don't want to make schools have to budget for that in their budget when we're the ones making the decision. And so that's not part of it. The most important part of this that I want to talk about, though, is, well, how did we decide how many dollars each school gets for next year? And it's a little bit technical, but you heard the superintendent talk about our equity-based starter budget. We have used this formula for several years. The important thing for you to know, though, is because we had COVID relief dollars, we were able to give schools more money than the equity-based starter budget allocates. So what we're doing for this coming year is we gave every school the amount of money that is equivalent to all of the positions and other resources provided through that equity-based starter budget formula. And I'll show you what's in that in a moment. And then there's also some additional funding on a per pupil basis. You see those numbers there, elementary, middle, and high. The reason middle and high are higher than elementary is there are different needs, there are sports and there are other activities. Middle school, we know we have extra needs around social emotional learning. And so that's why those allocations are different. And you also see we do a small allocation per student in our magnet schools. That's because of the additional work that's involved in magnet schools in recruiting students, right? They have a different need to do things like recruit students and maintain programming in order to recruit students.
Can I just say one thing in terms of the magnet allocation? And some of you might remember before COVID, as we were doing the equity-based budget, that magnet allocation was reduced and was supposed to be completely phased out. However, we did decide to leave it as is, only because of, we want to make sure that we're also allowing our magnet schools to be true to some degree to their theme, because as magnets bring students in, that also means additional revenue.
So you may have seen this slide before in previous Hartford Public Schools budget conversations. This is the equity-based starter budget that we've talked about. And these numbers have remained the same for several years. And what this tells you is how many different positions did we give a school in their budget based on their enrollment and the needs of their students. The difference this year is we turned these positions into dollars, and we gave the schools basically a template with a certain amount of dollars and said, you can fill this in with the positions that you most need to meet the needs of your students, within this dollar amount that we're giving you. But every school, right, is receiving a dollar amount that's the equivalent to all of these positions, as well as the per pupil dollars that you see at the bottom of the slide. So that's how we determine the funding. It being very transparent, right? I said this at the beginning, but I want to say it again because it's so important to understand. We have had access to significant extra resources for 3 years. And because we had access to significant extra resources for 3 years, schools have had the benefit of having more positions and more funding, and in some cases, significantly more positions and funding than this formula yields. And unfortunately, because those COVID dollars are going away, we don't have the ability to sustain all of those additional positions that we were able to do for the last 3 years. The other thing I want to point out is you heard the superintendent earlier talk about our revenue, right? The money we have coming in has been flat for almost a decade. There's little fluctuations, but you know this from your own pocketbooks, right? Inflation is real. What it costs us to do things has gone up every year, but our revenues have stayed the same every year. And so the reality is, in many ways, the extra money we had for the last 3 years, it kind of masked the fact that this is a problem that predated the pandemic. It's a problem that is after the pandemic. If we continue to have flat revenues, but the cost of doing things keeps going up, we will have this conversation every year, right? Because every year we will have less money than we need for the expenses we have in front of us. But it's just so important to understand, because there will be real reductions in schools. And that is a function of the fact, like we have not cut the equity-based starter budget, right? The number of positions, the funding we're providing matches what's been in this formula for several years. The difference is we had extra resources that allowed us to go significantly above this formula for the last few years.
And some of those resources were in the form of positions that we at the district office said, let's increase, for example, social workers as an example. And schools also receive equity innovation grants. Some schools were also able to add additional positions through those grants as well. Those will no longer be available.
So we also mentioned though that we're giving schools autonomy and we're giving a school-based budget. We also have done a lot of community input gathering. We had our community forum in November. We had another in January. We've been talking to union leadership. We've been listening to our board. We've been listening to our students. We had a budget session with the Superintendent Student Advisory Council. And so one of the things we included in the budget template we gave schools was some minimums, where he said, you have autonomy to decide what positions you're going to fund in your budget, but you have to meet these requirements. Some of them are based on contract, right? So we can't violate contracts we have with labor unions, but some of them are based on priorities. So you see a principal, an assistant principal, an executive assistant, right? Those make sense. A social worker for every 325 students. That's the same ratio as in the equity-based starter budget. And we know our student need for support from our social workers, right? We wanted to sustain that. Same thing with counselors, right? That's the same, those are the same thresholds that we have in the equity-based starter budget. The family community school support provider, we know the importance of engaging with our families. We said schools have to have at least a 0.5. Now you might be thinking, well, what does that mean, a 0.5? That just means that it's a family's, an FCSSP who is working half-time at one school and half-time at another school. So we're saying every school has to have at least that. Many of our schools, right, they're doing this work now. They're building their budgets right now. Many, I would even say most of our schools will have at least one, right? They're choosing to prioritize that. Art and music, that came out loudly in community conversations. It was a priority for our board, but we're also facing a crunch. And so what we said to our schools is you've got to have at least a halftime art and at least a halftime music. So again, that's an example where you could have an art teacher who teaches the first semester at one school. They teach the second semester at another school. So it allows us to extend our resources, but it also allows us to ensure that every student has access to art and music. And then obviously the last one might be the most important, right? We want to maintain class sizes. And in our contract with our teachers union, we have maximum class sizes. And so very clearly, one of our requirements is when they built their school-based budget, they had to make sure that classes would not exceed those requirements. So they had to have enough teachers to ensure that.
There's only another point that I want to make with regard to the class sizes is that in previous years, class sizes had not been maxed. So this is a year in which we're saying we're not going to go over what the obligations are, but we're also want to get as close as possible to see if that gives us additional revenue, and it does actually.
And then the other thing I want to be clear about is I said before, we're not making schools budget for things that the district's making the decisions about. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but what I want you to understand is all of the things you see on this slide are being given to schools in addition to the allocation that we talked about from the equity-based starter budget. So at the district level, we make decisions about how many special education, TESOL, or bilingual resource teachers, speech staff, nursing, custodial, security officers. That's a decision we make at the district level based on need and based on different variables. So schools do not have to account for any of these positions in their budget because these are being given to them over and above. You might be wondering, well, why are special education positions not in the school budget? The reason is the number of special education positions, be it teachers or paraprofessionals, paraeducators, is a function of the need of the individual students, right? All of our students have an individualized education plan, and the level of need for each of our students in each school drives how many staff we provide in each school. And that's why it's a district decision, not a school decision. And then also on the non-position side, you can see we're providing, one of the things I want to note here is the second bullet, right? One of the things we've heard from time to time is concern coming from teachers about not having money for classroom supplies. And we have always provided funding for classroom supplies, but we also given schools have had some flexibility to move money around. One of the things we're doing in next year's budget is we're saying every school will have $40 per student for instructional supplies that can't be used for anything else, can't be transferred to anything else. And then you see other categories, for example, sports. So schools don't have to account for the cost of coaches, officials, busing for their athletic programs, because that was also a priority we heard, was maintaining our athletic programs. We've expanded middle school sports, and that's something that we remain committed to. So I'm gonna hand it back to the superintendent to talk about what else can we do to address some of the challenges we're facing. Yes. So schools don't have to allocate for sports in their own budget.
So that'll be centralized, and it's one of the things that we're saying we're not going to sacrifice that, because we've worked so hard, and we know that students experience that connection. Remember, we talked about those two priorities. One of the priorities is a connection, and so we see it. Our students tell us that they experience that through athletics. So outside of the mitigation efforts that we're engaging in, I do want to fill you all in on what's been happening externally, if you will, to help improve our financial situation. We do engage with Capital Strategies Group. It's our lobbyists, and so we've worked with a lobbyist for several years. They have a lot of experience working with Hartford Public Schools, have great relationships, and you know, the session, this one is a shorter session at the legislature. It opened on February 7th, and with this session that is shorter, and with less of a focus on the budget, obviously, in this session, and we heard Deputy Foster say, hey, we thought we were going to get this, and then on February 14th, I think it was when the governor said, no, we're going to do it this way. Then we know that there will be a significant impact for us in K-12 education, because he's proposing to remove that cap. And so for us, you know, we have to continue to be actively engaged in the advocacy so that we can get the savings. And then, you know, we have to think about how do we continue to engage our delegation at the legislature. We know that some efforts were already made last year, right? Otherwise, you know, that $11 million wouldn't have been committed. However, given the proposal of the governor, we then are thinking, how else can we be actively engaged? And so, you know, on the 14th of February, I think it was a day after the governor made his announcement. So I met with the speaker, Speaker Ritter, and the delegation to explain what the impact would be on Hartford Public Schools. We also participated in a press conference. I joined the education committee, and we spoke about, and actually not just the education committee members, but there were other groups represented. Our union leaders were there, the Association of Public School Superintendents. I mean, we came together to talk about how important it is for the legislature not to move, if you will, on their commitment. And then this, on February 22nd, we sent a very detailed fact sheet to the Hartford delegation, the education committee, the leaders of the appropriation committee, and other legislators, because one thing that we heard during I think it was the next day after the governor had made his announcement, was some conversations that Hartford still had all this ESSER pandemic relief funding that was not spent down. And so Hartford, you have $60 million that shows. So how come you're asking for more money when you haven't, you know, spent all the money? And so we had to clarify that record really, really fast to say, we do have a plan for every dollar, every penny up until September, because you heard Deputy Foster say, we're going to use some of that pandemic relief funding during those first 3 months of the school year. And so we had to spend time clarifying that, and also making sure that people understood the impact of that $11 million. And it still means that we have a deficit. So we need all the monies, right, that we can get our hands on. And then this past weekend, right, we published an op-ed piece so that we can communicate also the impact and what that $11 million could mean for us, and the reductions, for example. And I think if you can drop a link to that op-ed to those that are joining us so that they can read it if they choose to. And then yesterday there was additional advocacy. I testified along with some students during the Education and Appropriations Committee hearing. And I would say that that's just the beginning. We will make sure that we continue to create a grassroots approach. And this is where all of our voices, if you will, matter, right? We're going to be, and I'm asking that you all were engaging our educators, our community partners. We have an upcoming meeting with our faith-based leaders, with our community-based organizations, to also engage in the conversation as to all of these details, but also to ask for a collective approach in this advocacy. And so as part of that approach, we've been passing out some of these postcards that we'll be sending to Governor Lamont and our legislators. And they asked the governor to reinstate, and the legislature, to reinstate the tuition cap and explain what that funding means to us at Hartford Public Schools. And so before you leave, if you can, take a postcard, all you have to do is just put your name on it, and we'll take it so that we can send it off. We have those in English and in Spanish. Again, I think it is very important for us to continue to engage in the conversation and in the advocacy. And we have here some snapshots, if you will, from yesterday's testimony in the Education Committee. You can see images here of our students from University High School who are part of the Social Justice Club. They actually had met with Representative Curry before, and here they spoke with Representative Curry and State Treasurer Eric Russell. Our Hartford Public High School students also testified, and they were advocating for the funding. And so, right, extremely proud of our students for stepping up and speaking on behalf of not just themselves, but their peers and our entire district. We had some board members that were there as well. Our union leadership testified as well. We've been working together to make sure that we have a unified voice and approach to our advocacy. So we can pause here and see if there are any questions either that have come in through the chat or even here, and suggestions. We're open to the conversation. Hyacinth. I know.
One of my questions is, how many children are we sending out of Hartford to suburban schools?
About 4,200, 4,000. Oh, I'm sorry. The question. Okay, the question so the question is, how many students go out to schools outside of Hartford Public Schools? So about 4,200.
Okay, and how much are we paying for each kid that goes out of Hartford?
The challenge there is, and Deputy Foster, you can see how you can answer from another angle, but the challenge there, Hyacinth, is that, Ms. Hyacinth, is that if a student has an additional level of need, we have to pay extra. So for example, if a student is a special education student and they require a paraeducator as part of the individualized education plan, we have to pay the tuition, the regular education tuition, plus the special education cost. And so it varies, and it can be a big amount, especially for students that need specialized programs, that we have to send them out to an outplacement facility. I mean, we that can easily average $70,000.
So it varies then. Kids with
Yes.
special needs have to be more, and kids just ready to go. It's a different, so the kids who are ready to go, what is the cost? I'm trying to figure this one out.
Go ahead.
4,200. How much, you're wondering how much that
How much
costs?
it costs.
So I just want to be clear that there's two different categories of students who go out. Sorry, the question was,
How much are we spending for the 4,200 students that go out?
Yes.
so the tricky part on that is students leave Hartford in two different ways. Some go to magnet schools run by other operators, and some go through something called open choice to a suburban school. For students who do not have special needs, we actually don't pay any tuition if they go to open choice. We only pay if they go to a magnet school. But in both cases, magnet or open choice, we pay all of the costs associated with any special education needs. And that's really just to I would sort of give you some numbers on this, because as we look at our FY25 budget, next year's budget, if the cap doesn't get put back, we will spend between 122 and 125 million dollars on tuition. But the important thing for you to know is $86 million of that is for special education services. So
Right, the reason why I'm pressing you on that is because I need to know how much you're paying for those kids that go to suburban and how much you're paying for the kids that come from Hartford that are in Hartford school. Because it gives me an idea what it is we're really paying for. All right, and I want to also go back
Give
to
it to me.
how much is it costing us for busing these kids into the suburbs every day?
Well, the transportation, it's not that it's tricky, but it's, the state pays an operator. The question is how much, do we spend to transport students to outside of Hartford? And so the state pays an operator to transport students, to magnets. And so we don't pay for all, not for all, but we do pay for students that are traveling within Hartford. Our students that stay in Hartford,
All right.
we have to pay.
Sorry, I have to skip through. So, okay, are we taking credit for the kids that is successful in the suburb that you send there? Or is it just looking like, oh, no, we're not even taking credit for all, we are paying for those kids that go to the suburb? So shouldn't we be taking credit that, yeah, these kids are successful? So when you go to the state, you can say, hey, we're sending 40-something kids out there, and look how successful they are. Because they're not looking, if you don't explain that, then they'll continue to say, why do I give you more money to throw in a sinkhole and you're not producing?
The question is, do we take credit for how kids are doing in other districts? And so we are not able to.
But we're paying for them.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying that we're not able to. Once the student leaves, the district, the receiving district, if you will, is fully responsible. We are responsible for the bill.
Okay. Think you found the problem.
you want to lift the chat question?
Yeah. So, just a question in the chat that is related to this line of questioning. How many of the students that leave the district do you feel end up coming back to the district?
Well, we can look into how many, how that number. What I will say is that not all students stay. Not all students stay. Some students come back. One thing that we have seen in the last, I would say 2-3 years, is at the high school level. We did not expect to have the enrollment that we have at our high schools. Now that's a good thing, because I remember when we were trying to finish the Weaver construction and folks were telling me, Superintendent, you are crazy to try to finish that construction because it's going to be an empty school. They're not going to come. Well, guess what? Weaver is at capacity. And so I say that because that might be an indication that students are not meeting or finding success where they are, and then they want to come back home for a high school experience. But that's a question that we can actually get to the actual numbers, and then we'll post them out. We'll post them on the website.
If you want to also articulate, just for those in the chat, we will send answers to these questions.
Yes, to those that are in the Zoom, we are going to send answers to the questions that were raised here in the room as well.
We have how many schools in the city of Hartford,
Well, 39 schools are Hartford Public Schools.
right?
And then we have our alternative program. We have Hope 1 and Hope 2. And then we have New Visions, which is our expulsion program.
Okay, so are you, and I'm all up to ask the question of, why do we have so many schools? Why aren't we looking at, consolidation or whatever the case may be? Sometimes you look at these schools and, yeah, it's not as full as we think, okay? Now, I always love my Weaver, Buckingham, and Upper High, right? And when you go to a basketball game and see some of these kids that, oh, what happened to all the kids that we used to have? Every school has a game, a team. And, when we were pushing, not for that much magnet, but some magnet, we said those kids should come back and go to our local Hartford Buckley and Hartford High sports. And all of a sudden, every school has a team. There's no competition anymore. Okay? The point is, everybody has a team. So the three high schools that we cherished for years are all dwindled. I look at Weaver actually, and they had a good team, right? They were lots of kids there. But you look at Hartford High, poor Buckley, I'm hoping we can get this building done.
We are going to go in 2025.
All right, but the point is what I'm trying to say, I think we have too many schools in the city of Hartford, knowing that we don't have the kids that we used to have anymore. And this trend of continuing to push this chef, it's not doing us any good. It continues to hurt us, and it has to be sunset somewhere.
Yes, I'm going to repeat the question. I'm going to try to turn it into a question. Well, you did ask the question, why do we have so many schools? And the other piece was the chef. Why do we continue to push it and it should sunset? I will say to the second question that the last agreement is supposed to have an end to it in about, I think is in about another 7 years, 7 or 8 years. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't go back to court, right? We're not a party, and so we don't know how that's going to turn out. To your other question about why do we have so many schools, and you remember, some of you might remember that we did some of this work and we consolidated, right? 20% of our schools, 12 facilities came offline. We spent 3 years consolidating, closing, and some of you might remember, I mean, I was very explicit. I still have the recording that I said, this work is not done. Because when we look ahead at the projection, birth rates were beginning to go down. The enrollment in the city was not going up. Now we see the trends here and in other places. I think there's a handful of cities in the state that are going in the opposite direction, but the majority are seeing a reduction in enrollment. And so I saw that coming. I didn't see the pandemic coming, but I saw that coming. And that's why I said to the community, this is part one, but there's gonna have to be another conversation about what that means. Now, at the high school level, we saw the inverse where, like I said, Weaver, for example, at fully enrolled. Hartford High has good enrollment as well. Weaver is gonna when it goes back to its home. Are there elementary schools that are under enrolled? They are under enrolled. That is a broader conversation, Ms. Hyacinth, and I don't have the power to close schools. That's a board responsibility. But I do believe that it has to be a community conversation.
But it has to be a conversation that you and the board sit and talk about to see, because if you can explain to them, look, we have a lot of school out there.
Yeah.
These are schools that, as we say, we're losing kids. You're telling me that we're losing another, how many for this coming up school year?
Yeah.
Right? We're gonna lose a lot more kids. So then that way that leads us, you know? So we gotta get real about this thing. And I understand, everybody wanna have their little school and they wanna do this, but sometimes it comes down to the point where we gotta bring it back together. Okay, because we're not gonna be able to survive. Our budget is not gonna get any better.
Yeah.
So we're gonna get worse.
Another question from the chat?
Yeah, I have 3 questions. They're related. So 2 of the questions are, can you discuss the money that comes into the district with students from other towns? So suburban, I'm assuming that's suburban magnet grant. What about the money that we pay for Harvard residents to go to correct schools, if you just want to reiterate the point you made earlier? And then a bigger question about planning for the future deficit, which you started to touch on a little bit. So if we could start with suburban magnet and then CREC, and then if we could talk a little bit about.
Just over the magnet, right?
Yeah, so the first question was to talk about the money that we get for suburban students who come in. So the way that comes to us is it comes in the form of what's called our magnet operating grant. So based on the number of students from the suburbs who attend magnet schools that are part of the Hartford Public Schools, we receive per pupil grant funding from the state to support the educational cost of serving those students. The second question was,
Hartford residents going to correct schools, are we paying tuition there?
yeah, and so that was the questions, do we pay tuition to Hartford residents who go to correct schools? The answer is yes. We pay general ed tuition for those students, and if those students have special needs, we pay 100% of any costs associated with meeting the needs in their individualized educational plan.
And just one more thing I just want to say, with the chef thing, okay? So a few years back, it might look like it's working, but that segregation thing, when I look at the kids that are watching when they go different kids in different schools, I'm saying, what happened to all my kids that was supposed to be coming in? They're not here anymore. Suburban kids, their parents not sending them into the city anymore. Okay, they're holding on to their dollars, right? Why aren't we holding on to our dollars? We just need to provide good service to these kids, so they don't have to think the grass is greener over there, all right? And again, I go back to say, in Hartford, for High Beaver and Buckley, we have millions of dollars to scholarship for our children. They're not accessing it because they go to suburban school. We gotta stand up and tell Terry, and we gotta do better in making sure we have all the resources we need in our school to make sure our parents can feel comfortable to send their kids into Harvard schools.
I agree.
What was the third?
The last question, Lisa, we have now in the chat is if you could talk a little bit more about future planning for deficits that we might be projecting in the future and things that we wanted to be strategic about balancing those scales.
Yeah, that is going to require the advocacy piece, right? Because money comes in through the city, the state, or the federal government. And so the fact that we don't get 100% reimbursement for special education costs, given that our special education prices are so high, is it what, 86 million that we pay in special education costs, right? We don't get a dollar for dollar back. So already we have to spend extra that we would have had to invest in schools to cover that. That has to happen at the legislature, right? Those are state funding formulas. So we thought that we were going to start having that advocacy, but we have to focus on the 11 million for this year. So I think that as we get ready to roll into the next budget season at the state level, that's advocacy. And that's something that not just I, but other superintendents and other boards of education are keeping a close eye on, because we know that post-pandemic, the needs are increasing still. And so we're seeing it. We are seeing an added level of need of special education, not only referrals, but the students that were already special education students have a higher level of need. So that level of need is not going to go down. It's going to continue to increase. But when we don't get the reimbursement, that creates the challenge, because remember, we're not only paying for the students in Hartford Public Schools that need special education resources, it's the students that are educated externally as well. That is, I appreciate your questions. What can we do now in the short term to advocate and for the longer term? I encourage everyone to speak to your local representatives. That is, they're still working, right? They're still in it. And so that's the next step. There's also conversations that can be had at the local level with city council members to see, hey, is there an opportunity to find funding for specific programs, for example, or maybe they're already thinking of funding community partners that support our students, right? How can we work together? And then is the broader advocacy, which is fully funding education ECS, which is supposed to be fully funded by 2025. And so we are hoping that that's going to happen. And then is the special education piece. I would say that's the big one. Now, more locally, to Ms. Hyacinth's point, I do think we have to have a broader conversation relative to Hartford Public Schools, and can we continue to exist and meet the level of need that we have with the programs that we currently have, the amount of programs in schools that we have? That is a real question.
My question, I'm wondering about the tuition cap. So does that affect how much money comes into the Hartford district from students coming out of district, or is that completely different?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So, and sorry, the question was, does the tuition cap affect kids going out of Hartford as well as kids coming in, or sorry, kids coming in as well as kids going out? So it doesn't, because the funding is different. So when suburban kids come in, we get funding per pupil through the magnet operating grant. The cap only applies to kids going out to magnet providers, and
So you would be getting less money from
that's right. The cap does not affect how much we have coming in. It just affects how much we would spend in tuition.
I was wondering about the Apple issue, because I know when it was brought on, it was supposed to be providing more transparency, and I'm wondering if it is, and I guess just a regular SGC member, I've never seen it, and I don't know, like, is it actually providing any help for our principal and our chairs? Because it doesn't seem on my end that it's actually providing any treatment.
So the question was, we brought in this program, the software program called AlloView, which was meant to bring greater transparency in the budget process, and is that working? And I think being transparent about that transparency, it's not been as successful as we would have liked, and we are looking at alternative options. We're looking at other ways that we can share more transparently with the budget. I mean, I think certainly the intent, it was a genuine intent on our part to try to be more transparent. It just hasn't worked out in the ways that we had hoped, and so we are looking at our options to consider something different.
We're actually not going to be renewing that contract, and we're already. I mean, just might as well just share it. We're not going to be renewing the contract, and we're looking for another tool.
I appreciate that, because I think there'd be a lot less confusion if people
That's fair.
had more
Yeah.
access to the information. Like, I've already learned a lot more. Just one more question. So I'm just worried about lowering standards for projections. That, like, my daughter wants to go into engineering, and we've already, like, chemistry is not required anymore, and I think that's confusing, because for people who have not, it's like their first year, their kids go to college, they might not understand that they really need chemistry to go to like an engineering school. And with the budget, and it's not required anymore, like, what if schools are gonna be dropping chemistry? I'm very worried about this.
Yeah, I want to make sure that we provide opportunities for schools to find those efficiencies and not lose on that. It might mean that there might have to share across campus. I don't know what that would look like, but we don't want to lose out on making sure that our students are college and career ready and have that added level of rigor and exposure. With the chemistry, with AP courses, the same. So I want to make sure that we maintain that as much as possible, but it might require some creativity.
That can make it harder to get suburban kids. Like, I can just stay in my district.
And take, yeah.
But then Hartford has so much to offer. And hopefully we can get
Yes. Yes.
Hey, I'm Phil Berger, and I'm interested in, a lot of it is the transportation side of it. Would you happen to know, and the cost for transporting those students out to these other schools? Do you have an idea? And I understand that it's covered by the state, overall taxpayers.
So the question was just, do we know the cost of transporting all the students out of Hartford to suburban or magnet schools? Not off the top of our heads, but we can add that to the FAQ.
We can ask the state for that, given that they pay an operator.
You just don't have that at your fingertips. I'm just curious, so we'll look at it later. So I can't avoid the impression, and I don't know the reality, okay? But the impression that, okay, we gotta transport people. I don't know if it's like the right size bus. Like I'm imagining like empty seats, or maybe you could use a van, or depending on like. So it's just like a matter of logistics allocation. Do you have an idea of like when different students have to go to one place or another? Are there empty seats on the transportation? And it just seems efficiencies may be able to be found. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. So the point was just that are there efficiencies to be found in transportation around the right sizing the buses, and are there empty seats? And I think, I won't speak for the state who's responsible for the transportation of our students out. I don't honestly know the answer to that question. I think internally, our transportation team works incredibly hard the way we tier our buses to make sure we're using our buses to maximum capacity. We have a mix, right? We certainly have big buses, little buses, right? All of that.
They continue to sort of right size them according to their
Yes.
destination.
Well, in transportation, we've talked about this little. Transportation has been a cost driver for us, and so we are very mindful of it. One of the things that is a risk factor in the coming budget is, we're subject to procurement rules, and we have to go out to bid this year for our transportation contract, and we don't know, right? There's been a lot of inflation. You all see it at the gas pump, I'm assuming, and car prices and things like that. We don't, until that bid comes back, we don't actually know exactly what we're going to pay for transportation for the coming year, and that's a risk for us this year.
And on that bid that's coming up, I'd be interested to help out a little bit in the level of if you're able to request the provider to provide electrified transportation, that will bring those costs down, like perhaps 1/3 of the cost, and you won't even have the maintenance. Things of that nature that'll really help you out.
Yeah, appreciate the offer. Yeah.
Thank you.
When my kids were going to school, I live in the South End. My kids went into the North End. I transport my kid every morning there. Whenever I couldn't, I said, take the bus home. I think we've spoiled our community so bad that we're all ourselves. I mean, what's wrong with, we used to walk 5 miles to work for school. What is wrong with us?
So you're suggesting students use the public transportation. I will say, one of the bills yesterday that our students testified about, it's a bill on disengaged youth, but part of that, which our students were, they authored part of that language, is to provide free access to public transportation 2 hours before school and 4 hours after school. And so that, I think, will be a game changer for,
Hey, it's costing less if we can get our kids in the bus, and we have more bus running more often.
So yeah, there's one more, so question in the chat, is specifically, okay. So are there services that other districts are providing specifically around special ed that are more attractive to residents, and that's why they leave? Are there things we can learn about what other districts might be providing? Will you clarify?
are there services
and programs in other districts that are more attractive? And are there things that we can learn? I think the first thing I'll say is that, individualized education plans are specific to the student and the student needs. And so, paraeducator need is a paraeducator need in Hartford or in Manchester, where that's an example. What I can also say is that when a planning and placement team meeting, PPT meeting, is held at another district, we're not always at the table if it is an open choice district, right? We don't have the resources, the staff to be at all of these meetings. And so, decisions sometimes are made and we have to pay for it. So that's a challenge. And we do have a team that is, for the most part, present at the magnet PPTs and other magnet operators. But the service, we still have to pay for.
And I think as a follow-up, if we could also just clarify some of the services that Jen Hoffman and Special Ed provide for our students in district.
Yes.
It may not be a comparison of services, but there might be other factors.
Yeah, well, that's an important point. We do have in-district specialized programs. It's something that when we were working on the district model of excellence and right-sizing the district, one thing that we heard from community was, can we have a specialized program, special education program in each zone of the city? We've been able to do that in the last 4 or 5 years. And so that means that if a student needs an outplacement, we are saying you don't have to go out. We have the program here. And so that is why it's important for us to continue to educate families that live in the city but attend the suburbs, because a suburb team might say, no, let's outplace the student. This is why it's important for us to have the resources, the staff, to be at that meeting to say, no, you can come home. We have a program at one of our schools.
I'm curious about, you mentioned earlier about the mental health situation. Can you get into that a little bit in terms of, it sounds like what's being provided for the students? In all reality, I try to take a different tack on things whenever possible. You know what's the situation, I'm trying to solve things, right? My impression is perhaps about the parents. Like, I don't know the mental health of the parents, to tell you the truth. And my inclination is maybe efficiencies may be found by like some group mental health therapy for some of the parents. And then you might not even need to worry about the students, because then the parents will have an even feel at home and they'll be like recalibrated and they'll be able to take care of their own children.
So I'm going to try to turn that into a question. And what's the role of the parent, and how can we provide support for the parent in a group setting? One thing that I reflect on often is that our students that come to us, some of our students come from very challenging family community situations and communities, that have a lot of need. And so we are trying to, for example, through our community school model, to support the student, but also their families. I mean, we have partnerships. The Village for Children and Families, for example. Catholic Charities is another one. They provide those supports, clinical supports, not just for the student, but for the family unit. And that's something that we're actually thinking about how to maintain in this budget, because over the years, we actually expanded the community school model because our community said to us, we need that in all of our schools. And so we're trying to think about how can we get resources to pay those community partners, because our social workers can't do it all. But I hear your point on the family support.
So do you have numbers and how many suburban special needs kids are coming into Hartford? Or is that?
We can get you the information, the number.
I would love to know.
So the education cost sharing are the state level formulas that give the district extra money for according to the number of families in poverty and the number of families that are English learners. When Hartford receives those funds, for example, for multilingual learners, are they allocated, are they set aside and allocated in a specific case that they those services for students and families fall into that category, or is it just merged into the general budget? And I'm asking
Great question.
because, Superintendent, you mentioned fighting next year for more funding for special ed and ECS. Like, we're just now finally seeing those formulas fully funded, as I understand. But those formulas should be even better. We should be getting, partners should be getting more money for those students who fall into those categories. So if we as a community fight for those formulas to be strengthened, and we fight for more money for multilingual families, how can we be assured that it will translate into resources that will come to multilingual families and be effective with that process?
Deputy Foster, you can answer that, but if you can go to slide 14. There you go. Only because I wanted to show how there's an allocation for extra for schools.
Yeah, no, that's one of the ways we fund. So we don't explicitly take the sort of, right, with the multilingual learners in ECS, there's an increment that is added per student based on being multilingual learners. We don't specifically take those dollars and kind of put them in a separate pot, but we certainly are doing things like what you see in the equity-based starter budget to make sure we're meeting the needs of our multilingual learners. The other thing, since you did ask the question on the ECS, I just wanted to name something that I was thinking about earlier. So as you mentioned, in the education cost sharing formula that is hopefully soon to be fully funded, it does have increments for students who are in households in poverty or students who are multilingual learners. Notably, there is no element of the formula based on students who have special needs. Connecticut is one of 3 states in the country that has no allocation in their state funding formula for students with special needs.
Do you think we should change that at the legislative level? I mean, you'd be surprised at the areas that Connecticut's held back, but are we not? They say that statistically we're the wealthiest state of all of them. Of course, it's down in Fairfield County, we know that. But, and again, we're looking for efficiencies. And the thing that blows my, I'm sorry, it's just a comment. The thing that blows my mind is, like, I would hate to be a student in high school and not have chemistry.
Exactly.
It would make me feel really chipped, you know? We gotta find the efficiencies so we can maximize the programs.
Yeah, well, what you were saying is how do we maintain chemistry, which is what we're having to think about moving forward. The one thing I will say around the special education and a move in the right direction, there is a legislated special education task force that has been implemented, and I'm actually a part of that task force. We're tasked with looking at making recommendations around the funding structures, programming, additional professional learning supports, and so that's coming. We're nowhere near finished with the report and the recommendations, but at least that shows that the legislature is taking some action. There are practitioners, superintendents, teachers, parents, multiple representatives there. So I'm assuming, right, that the idea is to ultimately enact some of these recommendations and look at the formulas and the impact as well.
I have a question that you're aware. Are you aware that Harvard High doesn't have a chemistry teacher?
We are, am I aware that Harvard High doesn't have a chemistry teacher? We are aware that Harvard High, Weaver, for example, we have vacancies.
Right.
We still have vacancies.
So these are critical
Yes.
subjects for our young people.
Yes.
But can I just jump in though to emphasize, like, We do have vacancies in some critical areas like that in our schools. That's a function of teacher shortages. That's not a function of budget. I
We
just want to
have
be
the-
really clear about that.
We have the position, we have the money. We have the money for those positions. That has not been compromised. It's just we can't find people. That's different than what you're saying. That is different than what was raised in terms of lowering the standard by not offering the class. Yeah.
So question
But there, they have to be prorated. They might need, like, hazardous duty certified.
You need certified people to do that.
There's people, we just have to pick them correctly. And the way-
So a question from the chat is, behavior techs, are they recognized in the equity-based starter?
It was,
Or
can
are
you
they
go
part of the
to,
school formula?
can you go to slide?
Yeah.
That is the flexibility.
Right.
A school can decide whether or not, if they have the funding, to add a BT.
And many, I will say, as schools have been building their budgets, right? This is work that's actively happening. Most of our schools are making sure they're allocating for, some support from the behavior tech role.
I do have one more question. And this is what I need to know, because I remember during this pandemic, the Harvard board, you passed a $2.something million to send to Texas for someone to do some programming for our children in autism. And I just want to know, where did that money come from? Did it come from the budget or that was special grant?
Which one? Which program? The ESS, maybe?
Some program that
Must have been.
you gave someone
Yeah.
$2.5 million
Yes.
to do some work in Hartford.
Yes, it must be the ESS that,
So where would that money be coming from?
it was pandemic relief funding, and it is helping, it helped students in our neighborhood middle schools and high schools, students that had a higher level of need, that needed intensive support. We're not going to be able to continue that.
No, of course not, because I don't think we'll even touch that.
Actually, I would say, Ms. Hyacinth, the teachers were asked for the expansion of that program.
I think you should have paid the teacher in the classroom to do that job, instead of sending our money all the way down there. But anyway, it's river over water, whatever.
Water under the bridge.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Easy question. On this particular page you mentioned before, it's the budget one, right? It mentioned, I'm just looking for time, $260 per pupil and prepaying, et cetera. I'm not gonna ask specifics, but is that amount per pupil, is that per week?
No, that's for the year.
Oh,
Just to clarify, so the question for those on Zoom is the $260 per pupil per week? And it's not, so the vast majority, like if you look at the Hartford Public Schools budget, 90% of our budget is salaries and benefits for employees. So what that 260, 580, 410 represents is a small amount of money per student for the other stuff.
incidentals.
Right, that can be, having family night and ordering pizza for family night. It's that kind of thing is what's coming out of that. So it is not a large dollar amount, but it's meant to cover some of those extras.
Field trips.
Yes.
Science experiments.
Yeah. Yep.
Go to the museum.
Sure. Yeah.
Our community works so hard on positive, multiple learners civil rights last legislative session, and we're now in frequent meetings with the Department of Education about how it's going to be implemented at the state level. Does Hartford have any specific plans? Because what I like about the bill is it really ties together the students' rights and the parents and the families' rights as a whole package, because the parents have to be involved. Like, the parent over here raised the issue of chemistry getting cut. Many parents in our community wouldn't even realize that was going to happen because they can't understand what's going on well enough to be involved and to speak up. And so I was wondering, I think that funding is going through the family center for parent interpretation and translation. Is there any plan to move anything around or to change anything to better meet that, that implementation, which is not complete, but it's in the process?
The question was in terms of resources for families that need interpretation and or access to information. And
what we are doing, so last year we did increase the amount of that is available for translation services and supports. We are not making any reductions in that moving, into next year. And so we want to make sure that we maintain that increase that we did last year. Oh, interesting. Yes, I now I understand your question. So the question is relative to where those resources live within the equity-based starter budget. They do not live in the equity based starter budget. They live centralized in the centralized budget for the specific department. Excellent question.
Another question on the chat. One of the chat is about athletics, and athletics is noted in the non-position allocation for schools. And so, if you could, or maybe just talk through what that means as a chosen one.
So this is talking about, I think, this slide. And so, sorry, the question. Well, I guess I don't have to repeat the question because folks on Zoom probably saw it in the chat. But just why does athletics show up as non-position? So just it's a technical matter in terms of how we do our budget. When we say positions, we're talking about, generally speaking, full-time positions, right? A salary and benefits, whereas our coaches who are coaching our sports teams are paid a stipend for the coaching, so it's more of a part-time position, and that's just a function of like how we allocate dollars in the budget. That's considered, it's not a full-time position, so it is paying a person. It's just a function of where we put it, how we bucket the money.
And you've got the last question.
There's two parts. I think it's more like a comment at first and then a real question. So we were talking about the mental health issue, and you mentioned that both the village and Catholic Charities have been really supportive. Frankly, it kind of blew my mind. It's like a very novel, unexpected efficiency where I'm seeing that basically the public schools kind of being subsidized by the Catholic diocese. So good job on that.
So I'll clarify that. The way in which we partner with someone like Catholic Charities is through our community schools framework. And so we actually pay for them to have their clinicians in our schools in an after-school program.
It was close, but it was gonna blow my mind.
Yeah, no. So clarify. And they get additional funding, for example, from the Harfa Foundation for public giving.
Very good.
Yeah.
That's awesome. All right. So the actual question was, thank you for the clarification. The actual question, sometimes they have like a pie chart as like, but you have kind of everything sort of like a blown out Excel sheet is kind of what you have. But would you happen to know offhand costs for utilities such as electricity? Because frankly, I'm the clean energy guy, and we're thinking, what if we put solar canopies over some of these parking lots and kind of begin a little microgrid, and then we charging your buses, and so those costs they get knocked out. Especially with the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, you got 30% of whatever you're installing, and I'm sure you can find any number of educational provisions to almost get those things installed for free. And it's like local jobs, but then it's more cost savings is what I'm saying.
Yeah, certainly. I think the question was around utility costs, and I think certainly our building and grounds department is always looking for opportunities. I mean, the specific answer to your question, our utilities run about $10 million, but that's what's projected for next year. That's all in. I mean, that's water, sewer, gas, electric. So where there are opportunities for that, we're certainly availing ourselves. And certainly when we've been doing school building projects, there's lots of work that goes on to ensure that we are being as efficient as possible in the new structures, or the renovated structures, I should say.
Tenemos una pregunta, la última pregunta. Okay, we're going to give you the last question because we haven't heard you talk yet. La última pregunta.
task force regarding those funds, so that we can have successful students, and that students are not out on the streets. Sin importar el nivel de pobreza, sin importar si son de educación especial, si son de educación especial. Regardless of their poverty level or they're from special education, regardless. Ustedes dicen que no tienen los fondos suficientes, entonces, ¿cómo vamos a pensar que va a haber más estudiantes que van a salir de este país? Porque todos los estudiantes, todos, sirven a este país. So, because you're saying that you don't have enough funding, but how are we going to make sure that we have students serving, successful students serving our country? Because only successful students serve this country. ¿Cómo podemos trabajar en conjunto con la comunidad, con los padres, para hacer esto una realidad? How can we work together with the community, with the parents, to make this a reality? Porque se está viendo que en las escuelas, aparte de que no hay programas, se compraron programas, de que no hay maestros, aparte de eso, hay un problema grande en los desayunos. And also we're seeing at the schools, on top of it, we don't have enough funds, they're cutting programs also. We don't have enough teachers, and we also have a big issue with breakfast. Los malos desayunos que están adaptados. Entonces, no solo es tanto en ver programas como de transporte, y se le van a dar servicios a un niño de educación especial, hay más cosas, hay una problemática más grande, y hay escuelas que están tan y demasiado mal. So not only the issue of having these breakfasts and meals that are expired, we also have to look at the special education, the transportation, but we have bigger issues than that. There's some schools that are facing really bad situations. Entonces, ¿cómo y de qué manera vamos a cambiar esto? Porque esto a mí me entristece, porque yo veo tanto jóvenes en la calle, entonces siempre digo, será por los recortes en los presupuestos. So how can we change? So how can we change these? Because I do see a lot of young people out on the streets, and I'm wondering, this makes me really sad. And sometimes I wonder, does this have something to do with the cuts on the school budgets? ¿Y qué pasa? Se avientan la pelotita unos a otros cuando ya esta clase de cosas que hacen estas preguntas, siempre le envían la respuesta a otras respuestas diferentes. And what happens is that they throw the ball to each other. When you ask the questions, they're always kind of like send the question to someone else, and they don't really answer our questions. Ahora con los recortes que quieren hacer en los universidades, ¿cómo de qué manera piensa el gobierno que va a haber un astronauta, que va a haber un químico, que va a haber un profesionista? Y ellos mismos están cortando la cara. And right now with the budget cuts that are going to affect the colleges, how are the legislators and the politicians think that we're going to have successful astronauts, engineers, and professionals that are going to be helping us and representing us?
Bueno, dijiste mucho. You said a lot there. So I'm going to try to capture a couple things. Voy a tratar de contestar algunas de las cosas. En términos de, wait, are you translating or am I going to do it in Spanish?
No, you do it in English.
Sorry, yes. In your question about who can you go to, who can give us the money, I would say that there is the advocacy at the local and state level. And so communicating with legislators about the funding and the bills is still important. You talked about challenges at schools. I would continue to encourage you to reach out to not only the school principal, but also the Welcome Center, our team, so that we can understand what is the specific issue and we can address it. I know you've talked to us about the meals, and so we have our chief of operations that is willing to connect and understand what is the issue with the meals so that we can make it better. I think what I would say is we are here to partner and to make it better, but we need to know what it is so that we can support. We're here trying to work together, not only to advocate at the legislature, but to make sure that across all of our schools, our students have the programs, the supports that they need. So we are here and we look forward to the partnership.
Just one more question, quick. Do we get full reimbursement from our clinic from the state? Please, like Comfort, I have a beautiful clinic.
Yes.
Do they get full reimbursement?
It's through the Medicaid program.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. What, trust me, we are looking at we're looking under every rock. Okay, so what's gonna happen after tonight? We took the notes and the comments, and then we're gonna use those to think about what are the next steps, what additional information do we have to share with our community. You know, we have, we're gonna send out the dates for the public hearing, another forum, you know, all of that is more to come. We're still working through the process, and so the numbers are hopefully, right, we're gonna continue to work on mitigating the deficit. But we encourage you to stay working alongside of us so that we can try to solve it together. And the cards.
Please give us your postcards.
And thank you for coming out. I appreciate all the questions as well.
Bring some of those cards when you come, baby.
Okay, you got it.
Good idea.